My name is Benjamin Breen, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the Society of Fellows and a lecturer in the Department of History. I got my PhD at UT Austin in the Department of History, and my dissertation was on the history of drugs in the 17th and 18th centuries in the Portuguese and British empires. My book manuscript is an elaboration on my dissertation research into the drug trade called Tropical Transplantations, Drugs, Nature and Globalization in the Portuguese and British empires. And it's basically trying to argue that drugs as a category emerged out of imperialism and colonialism in the 17th century. It's arguing that drugs were a product of European incursions into the tropical world, and they represented both a commodity which was then seized upon by colonial powers as a way of profiting from the invasion of America, the slave trade, and the movement into the Indian Ocean. But it also became a form of resistance in the form of poisoning by slaves. It became an element in the scientific revolution because drugs kind of emerged as a category which merited further investigation. The whole concept of drugs, even the term drug, emerges out of this period in the 16th and 17th centuries and is essentially not so much a pinned down category which doesn't change as one which is a moving target over time. So what I'm concerned with doing is both establishing the emergence of drugs or the invention of drugs as a concept, and then showing how that concept moved through different periods of world history. So in the 17th century, something like coffee or tea qualified as a drug. And in fact, tobacco, another new drug in this period, was actually banned by various monarchs in the old world. And ultimately these drugs ended up actually becoming tools of imperialism, especially opium, tobacco, and arguably sugar, which some would define as a drug. And then where the book ends is the point in the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, when the concept of drugs splits into pharmaceuticals, which are thought of as benign, like aspirin, and into illegal or illicit drugs, which are then associated with the non-European world, with criminality, with indigenous peoples. So essentially what I'm trying to do is to chart the prehistory of what we know as drugs, and to show how the concept of drugs has an earlier history which has not really been established or spoken of in contemporary debates about the drug trade. And even though the substance might stay the same, the way society responds to it changes dramatically. Bayer actually still holds the copyright on the term heroin. Heroin was actually a pharmaceutical launched by Bayer as a follow-up to aspirin. And so there's advertisements which exist showing aspirin and heroin as being the two pillars of health. And heroin was actually prescribed as a treatment for colds and a way of getting people who were addicted to morphine off of their drug addiction. One other project I have, which grew out of my book project, is research into medical cannibalism, which was essentially the practice of early modern Europeans consuming human body parts as medical drugs. And the most common example of this is probably powdered human skull, which was consumed in large numbers, especially in England, it would appear. And one source I found actually says, specifically you need skulls from criminals in Ireland who were unburied. And you should scrape the moss off the skull, add it to wine, and then drink it for various diseases like epilepsy or impurities of blood. And I became interested in this because it's actually, I think, an outgrowth also of colonialism, especially in the context of eating mummies, because mummies represented the non-European world. There were mummies not only from Egypt who were being consumed, but possibly from Peru as well, from the Inca Empire. So I've become interested recently in how this practice of medical cannibalism actually is informed by the global spread of European empires. I've also worked on an online journal called The Appendix, which is a journal of experimental and narrative history. It has articles about historical topics which are usually not included in classroom syllabi or in popular histories. So the idea is to give a forum for people to talk about things which are a little bit more offside the beaten trail. At the Society of Fellows, I also, in the future, hope to develop a second book project, which will be a global history of magic in the early modern world. And what I've been interested in here is the idea that there's a lot of scholarship on witchcraft trials and on European and North American witches. But in my documents, especially when I investigate, for instance, Inquisition files relating to healers from Africa or the Amazon, their practices of healing are often construed as demonic possession or witchcraft or wizardry or magic. The Magic Project is partially inspired by the quote of Isaac Asimov that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I've become interested in the question of where we draw a line between magic, which I think of as usually something which Europeans think of as outside of the realm of science, and technology, which can have magical properties, for instance, the causing wonder, being unexplainable by ordinary means, or performing strange acts But technology is lumped into the category of the rational. And so by bringing this story into a global context in the 18th century, what I hope to do is to entangle magic and technology in a new way, and perhaps to give some insight into the contemporary interest in spirituality among, for instance, people in Silicon Valley who are obsessed with the singularity, or the sort of cult-like fascination with aliens among people in the 20th century. So this book is in some ways similar to my drug research, where I'm trying to take a category that we think we understand now, and by pushing it backwards in time, raise new questions about how it originated.